Little Fury killed people for money. He lived in Birmingham, rode a bicycle to work, and regularly failed to pay into a pension scheme. He wore a backpack and a watch. In the former, Little Fury carried 3 packets of cigarettes, a copy of Simulacra and Simulation, and a flask of Earl Grey tea. On the latter, it was 8:46 a.m. The cough implied the progression of an undiscovered tumour that would be his undoing. He disregarded it, preferring to keep his occasional appointments as short as possible. Besides this, Little Fury was totally indistinguishable from any Joe Blogs or poor marketing. No defining characteristics, no scars, no marks, grade 2 short back and sides. He worked day jobs as a cover, used different names, non-threatening. In a lineup, he could have been your neighbour, or your boss at Mr. Meaty's. You're listening to episode 2 of Pulp, Surreal Stories from a Nearby Skull, an audio zine broadcasting short fiction once per week, presented by the Sleepy Bones Detective Agency. The following story is intended for mature audiences only. Every once in a while, Little Fury would be contractually obligated to visit the good Dr. Daniel Daniels, who operated a garage clinic in Smeckwith. A total crackpot. Called himself the physician of the underworld because he made stacks tending to the health and welfare of criminal customers. Primarily, however, Dr. Daniels traded in experimental gear. He had something to share with the grizzled veteran, according to their last conversation. Upon acknowledging his guest, our good doctor quickly alt-tabs from his lewd browsing habits to his schedule. A quack, through and through, with his fake Australian accent, toothbrush moustache, Coke bottle glasses, and a bow tie to boot. With glee, the doctor greeted him. "It's always nice to have you drop by," he mused. Little Fury was unsure and uncomfortable, but never made unwelcome. "You called me, Doctor," said the killer. "I don't think so. Not unless you've done 8 years of medical school." Little Fury palmed his face in frustration as the good doctor skipped further into his den. You could comfortably fit 2 cars in it, but when it came to storing his career essentials, the doctor's space had become ever so cramped. A cinder block and pallet wood shelf lined every wall, and in every free space, some dastardly weapon of mass destruction sat with a little yellow price sticker. Daniels hopscotched over to his furthest storage cabinet, collected a briefcase, and 2-stepped back over to Little Fury with all the grace of an elephant in heat. With fingers to his temples, Little Fury asked once more why he'd been summoned to the doctor's derelict den. He'd been low on funds recently and was not in the market for an explosive debit card or electromagnetic Dr. Martens. The good doctor assured his friend that he simply had a gift for his longest standing regular. Atop his desk, Daniels placed the briefcase. He unlocked it, unclicked it, and opened it before Little Fury's eyes. Inside, a disassembled rifle. Without further explanation, the good doctor returned to his computer and asked simply, "Give it a whack for me, will ya?" For the past 2 years, Little Fury had refused to accept contracts outside of Birmingham city centre. With such a local position, his services were often unpaid and utilised for petty purposes, neighbourhood squabbles, and corporate bollocks. This time, he would end the life of one unfortunate citizen at random. He and Daniels had discussed a similar concept the previous week, and, in return for cold hard cash, the killer accepted the case of a moral dilemma, no questions asked. Plus, a random killing of this nature would likely be appropriated by some underground organisation, waiting for their first big terror-centric marketing push, and he knew he could take that out for a pretty penny. In the simplest of terms, Dr. Daniels had deemed it necessary that this weapon should see field testing regardless of the impact. He'd likely made a breakthrough, or at the very least he believed he had. It was quite clear that this weapon was no mere science project. It appeared that certain technologies had been appropriated from the munitions department of Foxtech Military, as the case bore their insignia, although to the good doctor's credit, he'd engraved his own logo over it, as well as the acronym GUN, standing for Generally Useful. No? It was lightweight and bolt action, just how he liked it. The barrel and stock resembled one of those old Springfield rifles from the First World War, but in the middle, the good doctor had Frankensteined the project together. He'd welded in a horizontal load, detachable magazine, a designer digital scope with adjustable magnification, and custom-tooled casing for an onboard computer processor. It certainly sounded like a real gun, but instead of a safety switch, Little Fury would find a knob labeled Touch Me. With a sigh, he did as he was told.
G-U-N. Generally useful. No.
This radiating tone was emitted from the rim of the scope itself, pulsating with enough frequency to draw Little Fury's attention. He would draw the weapon to his face, leaving 2 inches of relief from his eye. When the tone faded out, it was replaced by a gentle synthetic voice, an artificially intelligent virtual assistant dedicated to dispensing calculated tactical information and situational advice, with a voice that immersed him like the sound of your heartbeat in seawater. The voice in his head would go on to explain that thanks to groundbreaking science performed in the jewelry quarter, this sound was being beamed directly into his skull through his iris, as hard data morphed into sound by his unconscious brain, and that by utilizing this technology, he was agreeing to accept all liability for the consequences of his actions, i.e., loss of vision, loss of sensation, the development of tumor, benign or otherwise, a condition known as sniper's neck, and a list as long as 2 cigarettes of legal mumbo-jumbo. Finally, the virtual assistant would get to the important details. What could it do? Well, it could give you the current time.
It is around 9:45 a.m.
It knew the exact temperature.
From 10 to 11, it will be around 11 to 23 degrees Celsius.
And it knew that Little Fury should get his cough checked out. The sooner the better. This damn century, he thought. Smart homes, smart motorways, smart weapons? Did everything need an onboard intelligence? Or the ability to text message? Little Fury didn't need these features to kill people for money. Little Fury had been killing people for money for 13 years. He had become so used to the notion of killing people for money that he could refer to it as such in polite conversation and not bat an eyelid. In the grand scheme of things, though, there was a job to do here. It technically broke the industry standard no escort clause in Little Fury's contract, but this was a one and done. It was as easy as timing a shot to the nearby excavation work, moseying on back to Daniels, taking his money cash in hand, and telling him that his invention is awful and he should hide himself out of shame in whatever country he's pretending to be from. Little Fury scoped out across the passers-by, and as he stopped over his first potential target, the weapon's true nature revealed itself. In his sight and in his head, the virtual assistant was feeding him information about his victim. In this case, it was the knowledge that this young man in his sights was a baker of pies, a member of a Lynyrd Skynyrd and Skindred cover band called Lynyrd Skynyrd, and a single father of 2. With this ceaseless infernal tootling, Little Fury found it difficult to steady himself on a target. Along with this, he would also find that he could no longer switch this voice off. It would continue to inform him of pet puppies, sexual hang-ups, and online follow accounts. This one drives an ambulance. This one's in a band, have a listen. This one manages a cat sanctuary. In the end, Little Fury had to raise his voice at the computer in order to get it to shut the hell up. In the ensuing awkward silence, Little Fury had chosen from the lucky dip of remaining citizens. A woman, hands in her pockets, smoking a bent rollie, hood up. She was shifty looking, wearing sunglasses in the morning haze. She'd probably committed tax evasion or something, that'd do, he thought. Still, Little Fury hesitated. He waited, even, for the machine to add its factoid. Eventually, he would outright ask the assistant to comment on the situation. Red-faced and arrogant like a child, he could feel it, in the atmosphere between them, that the little voice in his head desperately wanted to let him know that this poor woman was the sole guardian of her 2 twin brothers, or that she was a non-smoker and her favourite movie was Juno. He only rolled his eyes for a second, but when they arced back to her, she was dancing around a park bench singing, and tossing confettied bread around her for a growing audience of local birds, squirrels, and deer. In the end, Little Fury couldn't fire upon a single target, and for that he felt a great hollowness that would soon be conquered by a pseudonym-verifying rage. "You think you know everything," said the killer, as he turned the scope on his axis, pointing it towards his own face. He taunted it to analyze him, and he was certain that he knew where he was going with it.
Contract killer. Total scum. Uncaring, insensitive, poor performance in team building. Horrid. Broken. Lonely. Beautiful eyes.
Little Fury was taken aback, of course, but for the first time in 13 years, the man felt a flutter in his heartbeat that hadn't been caused by a decade of bad habits. A quiet moment passes, and Little Fury fires blindly into the street. "Would you like to go for a drink?" asked the killer, to a resounding,
"I'd like that."
"It is what it is, I suppose. Man meets machine meets love at first sight. A tale as old as time itself." From their rooftop hotspot, the new couple fled to a nearby franchisee of the Flat White Duke Coffee Company. Here, the two of them would share a slice of the decadent chocolate gatto and a skinny mocha cappuccino, with just the one shot, please. And hold the foam, okay? She likes it milky. Little Fury was, he felt, finally at peace now, even as the officers hurried into that tiny little coffee shop off the main road. And boy, did they come armed. You have been listening to Your Heart in My Sights, an episode of Pulp, Surreal Stories from a Nearby Skull, written and directed by Jake Lucy. This production is copyright 2019 by the Sleepy Bones Detective Agency, and is intended for enjoyment purposes only. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Please visit us on the web at sleepybones.agency for more surreal stories.